first talk and move on to the second lecture, namely Shakespeare in Two Cultures. Now, to continue the principles of translation, methods of translation, I just have 2-3 points to add. This is the question of vocabulary and syntax is also taken into consideration. Vocabulary, syntax, and structure of the original. And we shall remember the fact that a language grows and adapts itself with use. According to me, this is a very important point because no language is ready-made for our intellectual purposes. All languages have to grow gradually to come to terms with the highest level of intellectual inquiry. That's the reason why I said a language grows and adapts itself with use. For centuries, the vehicle of intellectual discussion in Western Europe was Latin, as you all know. Abstract philosophical vocabulary was created only in the later Middle Ages. Until then, this particular language had not grown to the required level. Abstract philosophical vocabulary is not ready-made. It has to grow with the passage of time. The Indians especially boast of a long history of abstract philosophical language right from the Vedic times. So at different centuries, our philosophers, sages have added to the fund of vocabulary, and that has enabled us to say that our language has almost been perfected. But not the case with the European languages. For example, technical and scientific vocabulary was developed only recently, since the middle age 17th century, so to say. So even at the time of Newton, Sir Isaac Newton, only Latin was used as a vehicle of communication. Okay, English was what do we call? Lesser languages again, Bhashas. Now we call ourselves Bhashas. Kannada, English, Urdu, Tamil, Telugu, Punjabi, Sindhi, Marathi, Gujarati, all these are called Bhashas. Earlier we used to call them vernaculars. English was a vernacular language when Newton was coming out with his epoch-making book, Principia Mathematica. He wrote it in Latin. Newton wrote it in Latin and called the book Principia Mathematica. Later on, he translated that into English. So, what I mean to say is, the abstract philosophical vocabulary will not be ready overnight. It requires an army of writers to perfect the mode of expression, so to say. Therefore, it is a very fascinating subject, how vernacular language can grow to the language of standard reception. So this process is going on in one form or the other, somewhere or the other, all the time. So it happened in the case of the East European languages. For example, legal, political, philosophical and scientific discussion, which had previously been carried on in Russian or German, had now to be conducted in, for instance, Lithuanian, Estonian or Lettish languages, whose literary tradition was that of folklore and whose scientific and philosophical resources were practically non-existent. Folklore, but written standard language was not ready. Therefore, now we talk of Lithuanian language, Estonian language, Lettish language, etc., etc. So that's the reason why I said it requires a lot of trial and error to come to terms with the standard language which is ready for translation. Now I will just wind up giving you one analogy where Georges Mauny, an expert, a French scholar, says that the translation is a pane of glass through which we look at the work of art. The translation is a pane of P-A-N-E, pane of glass, through which we look at the work of art. This glass may be clear or distorted or colored. If the translator is very transparent, if you can understand the gist of the original, the content, the force of the original, his translation can be very, very near perfect. The answer is particularly complex when religious or literary works are involved. The cultural or geographical background conditions involve the employment of imagery, and the imagery is a vehicle of communication. Moving further, the glass may be clear or distorted and colored. Did you understand the example of a translation is a pane of glass? Clarity is always looked for. So this French expert is thinking of Gogol's definition of the perfect translator. Does it ring a bell? The name of Gogol? Russian, great Russian author who is ancient even to, I think, senior contemporary of Tolstoy and others, Dostoevsky, Gogol's, the great storyteller of Russia, from whose overcoat the Russian story has descended, they say. So he has given the definition of a perfect translator, Gogol. Who is a perfect translator according to Gogol? He is one who becomes a pane of glass which is so transparent that the reader does not notice that there is any glass. That is the definition of a perfect translation. Which translator is compared to a pane of glass. The pane of glass is so transparent that you hardly notice the presence of the pane of glass. So this ideal is obviously never reached in practice. There are always little flaws, ridges in the glass, and even the clearest glass has always an index of refraction. Even the clearest glass has always an index of refraction. Perfect glass of the ridges flaws. Therefore, the translation will be to that extent not perfect. The clear glass translation ought to convey the impression that the text we are reading was thought and expressed directly in our own contemporary language and uses the normal resources of that language for dealing with matters remote from us in time and place. The last point, the clear glass translation aims then at presenting as a foreign work in all the freshness of a new contemporary work. You take up the foreign work and with your mastery over the source language, you are going to convert that into a target language and almost that freshness of a new contemporary work is seen in your attempt. So the translator who aims at conveying the impression Dante made on his contemporaries, not the impression he makes on cultivated Italians today. So to wind up my first talk, because I am struggling to give you an impression that there was a beginning, middle and a gradual end in my talk. T.S. Eliot has summed up the creative talent beautifully, which equally applies to translation as well. He has said, I quote T.S. Eliot, We need an eye which can see the past in its place with its definite differences from the present, and yet so lively that it shall be as present to us as the present. This is the creative eye. I repeat, we need an eye which can see the past in its place with its definite differences from the present, and yet so lively that it shall be as present to us as the present. This is a typical T.S. Eliot's definition. So this is, according to him, is the creative eye. So as we have realized, the demand for translation of all kinds is great nowadays. Not all translators are good translators, as you know. Some are not even competent, but then they will pose, masquerade as the translators, as very able translators. All kinds of translators there in the field. Some are mediocre, some are bad, some are competent, some are good, some are excellent. So the spectrum is very, very wide. But the business of translation is going on relentlessly because that is the demand for the translators. We need every kind of translators of law, translators of scientific works, translators for literary works, so on and so forth. So translation has been going on since time immemorial, we can say, and it will continue in future as well. For example, a colleague of mine who is an accomplished translator translated Tolstoy's War and Peace some 10-15 years ago, and now he has translated Anna Karenina. So there had been translators in the past, and there will be translators in the future also. So let me spend time on the general process involved in the transference of the context of the text from one language to another. That is a long, drawn-out process. Let me stop at this point. I just now quoted the case of one of my colleagues who translated War and Peace earlier, 10 years ago, 15 years ago. Now he has translated Anna Karenina. And then War and Peace had already been translated some 30 years ago into Kannada. Tolstoy's War and Peace had been translated for the first time 30 years ago. But this friend of mine once again took it up to come out with a new translation. Because as we all know, that every 20 years the idiom of language changes. Therefore, a new translation is required. It's not as if one translator has translated a text and we can relax for eternity. So no other translator is required. That's not the case. New translation is required every 20 years because the idiom changes. That's the reason why the translators ought to be on their toes, and there is such a great demand for them nationally and globally, also internationally. Translators are in great demand. Unfortunate thing is that we have not been able to inspire the new generation of translators. For example, in a hall where some 20 of you are sitting at the moment, now I don't know whether you are making any translation efforts. If you are not making any translation effort, then how are we going to get new translators? How are we going to say that the next generation will come out with new translations of the earlier works? So such a challenge we must pick up and then tell the whole world that our literary scenario is not all that weak. We are not lagging behind. We are keeping pace with the changing world. We are coming out with new translators and we are up to the challenge. That's what we have to declare to the outside world. But unfortunately, we are not in a position to say so because you are not measuring up to the demand. You have to pluck up courage and start translating things, and that's the only way to answer this query satisfactorily. Will you all do that? Translate a small little book to begin with, and then moving on to a complex, more challenging, highly demanding work of art. Whatever that appeals to you, whether a story or a novel or a set of poems to begin with, and then you can move on to higher grades. But an attempt should be made. Somewhere you have to make the beginning. Without that preliminary attempts, I think we cannot prepare a body of an army of translators is required. In fact, an army of translators is required, and we are not producing them, unfortunately. And all this formal training of diploma in translation, MPhil in translation, master degree in translation, all these academic efforts are not yielding the desired results. That is the most unfortunate thing. They get the certificate all right from the academic institutions, but they go away. What they actually do as translators, will they live up to the promise? Will they be satisfied with just a certificate in their file? That is very unfortunate, because in our university we have been producing diplomas in translation for the last 50 years. But if you ask me, at least 50% of them have been translators. There is no positive answer, because they take this as a certificate and go away, and we do not know what really happens to their training as translators in the academic arena. So that is the unfortunate thing. The topic is very vast, but I will stop here and move on to another very exciting topic: Shakespeare in two cultures. What two cultures I am talking of? Obviously, Shakespeare, who wrote in the original English, therefore English culture, and I am primarily concerned with my mother tongue, Kannada, and what has happened to the translation of Shakespearean plays in my language, Kannada. That's the title, Shakespeare in Two Cultures. We go on till 12:45, and then there will be question and answer session for 15 minutes, I suppose. You can also put questions on the first talk, principles of methods and principles and methods of translation. Please reserve some questions for the first topic as well. Shakespeare in two cultures. Encountering an alien culture is not a simple and straightforward translation. Encountering an alien culture. English was an alien culture for all of us earlier on. So encountering such an alien culture is not a simple and straightforward translation. It has given rise to unfathomable turmoil. So leaving aside all other encounters for the time being, let us focus on our attention on the British culture, which has left a lasting impression on all of us. Particularly I am referring to English literature, and we can say with some degree of certainty that no native writer after the 19th century could afford to ignore the presence of British culture. After the 19th century, every writer worth his name has been influenced by British culture. So, in our own context, those writers who have reacted and responded to Kannada culture and Indian culture have inevitably responded to the English literature and culture. So, I can think of certain writers of the 19th century in my own language, Kannada. These names are really highly revered and respected. The first name regarding Shakespearean translation or adaptation comes to my mind is that of Deputy Channabasappa. Have you heard of this name? Deputy Channabasappa. These people have rendered human service to our native languages. So the first name that I can think of in respect of Shakespearean adaptation is that of Deputy Channabasappa. Another name, M.L. Srikantesha Gowda. Yet another name, very familiar name, B.M. Srikantaya. One more name, D.V. Gundappa. Masti Venkatesh Iyengar. Samsa. His name is Samsa. Kuvempu, Bendre, Sriranga, Gopal Krishna Adiga and others have all contributed for the progress of Shakespearean literature in Kannada. Some of them have translated from Sanskrit and English to Kannada, or they have been simultaneously influenced by the Oriental and Occidental writers. So the latter half of the 19th century, I think that should be taken as a watershed period as far as our response and reaction to Shakespeare's literature is concerned. The latter part of the 19th century should be taken as the watershed period which saw the spreading of English culture when the schools, colleges and universities and courts were established. Okay? Not until then, school, colleges, courts and universities were established. The latter part of the 19th century. Therefore, every important writer saw the inevitability of the development of his language, culture and personality by responding to both Kannada and English culture. Another redoubtable name that crops up in my mind regarding translation is that of Basavappa Shastri. It can be taken as a typical example. Basavappa Shastri was in the court of Mysore Palace. He was an Asthan Vidwan, and his case can be taken up as a typical example. For instance, he translated Kalidasa's Shakuntalam into Kannada, and though he did not know English, with the help of Chikkaballapur Subbarao, he adapted Shakespeare's Othello into Kannada and called his Kannada adaptation as Shurasena Charite. Othello becomes Shurasena Charite. He did not know English, Basavappa Shastri, and with the help of Chikkaballapur Subbarao, who knew English, he adapted Shakespeare's Othello as Shurasena Charite. So this can be taken as a pan-Indian phenomenon. That was not only confined to Kannada language alone. Probably it was true of Marathi, Punjabi, Bengali, Urdu, Hindi, so on and so forth. That's the reason why I called the Basavappa Shastri's example as a pan-Indian example. If you turn the camera to the northern part of our country, you will encounter Madhusudan, Ishwar Chandra Vidyasagar, Bankim Chandra Chatterjee, Rabindranath Tagore, representing Bengali language, Vasudeva Balakrishna Kelkar, Gopal Ganesh Agarkar, Bajbir Ramchandra Pradhan, Justice Govindrao Kanitkar, representing Marathi language, Abdul Halim Sharar, representing Urdu language, Gopal Ram Galmali and others belonging to Hindi. As far as Kannada is concerned, Deputy Channabasappa, M.L. Srikantesh Gowda, found it necessary to come to terms with two languages and two cultures. This is a new phenomenon where the scholars were, asked to come to terms with two languages and two cultures. Adapting and translating. Remember, these are two separate businesses in the field of translation. Adapting and translating Shakespeare into Kannada was also an attempt to appropriate British literature and culture. It's a question of appropriating an alien culture into our own milieu. However, there is a marked difference between the interest shown to Shakespeare and the other English writers. There is a difference. We cannot take it as uniform, homogeneous. For instance, Wordsworth's influence was predominant on the Navodaya writers, as we call them. The writers, the first 3 or 4 decades of the 20th century in Kannada are called Navodaya writers, Renaissance writers, and the people of different languages call the writers of the first couple of decades of the 20th century in different names, but we call them in Kannada Navodaya writers. So Wordsworth's influence was very predominant as far as the Navodaya writers were concerned. The Navyas or the modernist writers had only academic interest as far as Wordsworth was concerned. They were not enamored by Wordsworth because Kuembu accepted Wordsworth as a teacher in a way, because Wordsworth declared that nature is my teacher. Similarly, Kuembu worshipped nature and even went to the extent of saying that I have left Wordsworth far, far behind in terms of my philosophy, my vision, my capacity to locate divinity in nature. I have surpassed Wordsworth, said Kuembu. That is a separate matter altogether. What I am talking about is the response of the Navyas or the modernist writers as far as Wordsworth is concerned. For them, Wordsworth was only of academic interest. Similarly, the Navyas were more interested in the writings of T.S. Eliot, D.H. Lawrence, Kafka, Camus, and so on and so forth. Modernist writers actually were enamored of Lawrence, Eliot, Camus, Kafka, so on, other continental writers. The Navodaya writers' interest on these writers was more or less academic. They were not, enamored by Lawrence or Camus and Kafka, the Renaissance writers. So we can say that each generation has responded to Shakespeare without any exception. Whether we are talking of the Pragitishilas or the Navyas or the modernist writers, all of them have responded to Shakespeare without any exception. Translation and adaptation has been our preoccupation for more than 150 years. That is a very interesting phenomenon. In Kannada, for example, nearly for the last 200 years, we have been struggling with Shakespeare. Actors and directors, of course, have been staging the Shakespearean plays from time to time. The important reason for this kind of response is, as we all know, that Shakespeare is a big writer. Otherwise, we wouldn't have bothered to, pay so much attention to Shakespeare. Because he's a big writer, so much energy has been invested on Shakespeare. It's also true that his works are so rich that they can be interpreted according to the changing situations and circumstances as well. So he is amenable for multiple interpretations at various levels. His literature is so rich. Whatever it is, his plays have been adapted or translated into many important Indian languages. Harishchandra Ghosh translated The Merchant of Venice into Bengali in 1852. Girish Ghosh brought out the Bengali version of Macbeth during the same period, middle of the 19th century, 1850. Sunil Chatterjee's observation regarding such exercises is as follows. Why Bengali writers went to Shakespeare so frequently? The critic Sunil Chatterjee makes this observation. I quote, "It was not possible to do justice to Shakespeare in the translation of the 19th century. The Bengali language of that period did not possess the vitality and the metrical versatility." This is a very important point. Did you follow this? I quote from the beginning Sunil Chatterjee's observation. It was not possible to do to do justice to Shakespeare, in the translation of the 19th century, the Bengali language of that period did not possess the vitality and the metrical versatility. Our mind had not attained the maturity and the complexity to understand the internal conflict embedded in the Shakespearean world. ಎಷ್ಟು ಫ್ರ್ಯಾಂಕ್ ಆಗಿ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ನೋಡಿ, ನಮ್ಮ ಭಾಷೆ ಬೆಳೆದಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ, ಅಷ್ಟೊತ್ತಿಗೆ ನಮ್ಮ ಭಾಷೆ ಬೆಳೆದಿಲ್ಲ, ಬೆಂಗಾಲಿ ಭಾಷೆ ಬೆಳೆದಿರಲಿಲ್ಲ. ಟು ಡೀಲ್ ವಿತ್ ದಿ ಇಂಟರ್ನಲ್ ಕಾನ್ಫ್ಲಿಕ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ಎ Shakespearean play, we had not attained the maturity and complexity. Our language had not grown. According to Sunil Chatterjee, it is possible to yoke Shakespeare's play to contemporary language because now it has the flexibility and subtlety required for such an enterprise. Until now, we could not say that we are up to the challenge of translating or adapting a Shakespearean play. Now our language possesses the flexibility and the subtlety required for such an enterprise, he says. And I think Harivansh Rai Bachchan's observation is also important in the context. Who is this Harivansh Rai Bachchan? Amitabh Bachchan's father. He was a great English teacher. He wrote his thesis on W.B. Yeats. Harivansh Rai Bachchan wrote his PhD thesis on W.B. Yeats, a wonderful poet himself and a great critic of the language. He says regarding Hindi, I quote, many of those who staged Shakespeare's plays had not understood them properly. Many of those who staged Shakespeare's plays had not understood them properly. In the real sense, there were no Shakespeare's translations in Hindi. There were a few Urdu adaptations and a few plays which were based on Shakespeare's themes. ಅಷ್ಟು ಬಿಟ್ಟರೆ ಪ್ರಾಪರ್ ಶೇಕ್ಸ್ಪಿಯರ್ಸ್ ಪ್ಲೇಸ್ ಟ್ರಾನ್ಸ್ಲೇಷನ್ ಅಂತ ಹಿಂದಿನಲ್ಲಿ ಇರಲೇ ಇಲ್ಲ ಅಂತ ಹೇಳ್ತಾರೆ ಹರಿವಂಶ್ ರಾಯ್ ಬಚ್ಚನ್. ಮೋಸ್ಟ್ ಆಫ್ ದಿ ಕ್ಯಾರೆಕ್ಟರ್ಸ್ ಇಂಡಲ್ಜ್ಡ್ ಇನ್ ಆನ್ ದಿ ಸ್ಪಾಟ್ ಡಯಲಾಗ್. Only the original story and plot were retained, but there was no original dialogue in the plays. This is the situation as far as Hindi is concerned regarding its response to Shakespeare. So, original story and plot were retained, some themes were reflected and borrowed from Urdu, but no proper dialogue in Hindi reflecting the original Shakespearean play, he says. In case of Kannada, for example, as I've already said, Shakespeare was brought into Kannada for the first time by Deputy Channabasappa. His real name was Channabasappa Basavalingappa Dharwad. He got the sobriquet Deputy as he was an officer in the education department during the colonial time, and his play ನಗದವರನ್ನು ನಗಿಸುವ ಕಥೆ. ನಗದವರನ್ನು ನಗಿಸುವ ಕಥೆ was the adaptation of the Comedy of Errors Shakespeare play. The Comedy of Errors was adapted by Deputy Channabasappa as Nagadavaranu Nagisuva Kathe. It was published in 1871 from Dharwad. Since 1871, that year can be taken as a watershed year. In fact, since 1871, the Kannada writers have adapted and translated Shakespeare again and again, and also they have brought him on stage also. As George Steiner says, that translators and critics divide translations into three categories. George Steiner, a very important expert of translation, has said that translations can be divided into three categories. First category comprises strict literalism. We have already referred to literal translation, faithful translation. This first category comprises strict literalism, means word by word matching of the interlingual dictionary, word by word matching of the interlingual dictionary. The second category is the great central area of translation, trans-lation, by means of faithful but autonomous restatement. It is faithful, at the same time a bit autonomous. This second category is faithful, alright, but at the same time it is also autonomous, enjoys some liberty with the original. The translator closely reproduces the original but composes a text which is natural to his own tongue, which can stand on its own. This is second category. By the very definition, you can say this is tolerable, this is acceptable, so to say. Yet we have the third category. What is its nature? It is called imitation. Third category is called imitation, recreation, variation, and it is an interpretative parallel. It is an interpretative parallel. Now, my mind goes back to John Dryden, the great 18th century prose writer and translator of Homer, great classics. Dryden has something similar to offer. Just as George Steiner came out with three categories of translators, Dryden has also come out with three categories of translations. What are they? Metaphrase, paraphrase, and imitation. These are the three categories which he calls art of translation. He divides this art of translation into three categories and calls them metaphrase, paraphrase, and imitation. Metaphrase is turning an author word for word, with which we are familiar. Turning an author word for word and line by line from one language into another. So you can decide for yourselves how acceptable it is. Turning an author word for word, line by line, and from one language into another. Second category, paraphrase, is translation with latitude, where the author is kept in view by the translator so as never to be lost. This translator keeps the author in mind always. He will not be distracted from the author, but at the same time takes certain liberties, allowable limit as we say, and works within that framework. Yet we have the third category called imitation. Here the translator assumes the liberty not only to vary from the words and sense, but to forsake them both as he sees occasion. So he assumes liberty not only to vary from words and sense, he moves away from the text perhaps so drastically. This third category translator who follows imitation moves drastically away from the original text, taking only some general hints from the original. Therefore, you can draw your own inferences. Among these three classes, Dryden is happy with the middle one, middle path. What is that middle path? Paraphrase. Paraphrase. So this ensures that the translator can be closer to the original author. The paraphrase path, middle path, ensures that the translator is closer to the original. Metaphrase is more a copying the words than anything else. It's much like dancing on the ropes with fettered legs. Therefore, it's not acceptable. Dryden believes that imitation and metaphrase are two extremes which should be avoided by the translators. Both of them are extremes. So the middle path is acceptable, paraphrase. So the method of classifying translations into three divisions applies to the Kannada translation or adaptation of the Shakespearean plays. G.K. Churumuri's Raghavendra Rava. There is a translator or adapter called G.K. Gopalakrishna Churumuri, and he has adapted Othello as Raghavendra Rava. The year of publication 1885. 1885, Raghavendra Rava, A.K. Churumuri, Othello. And Parvatavani is our contemporary writer. He has adapted The Taming of the Shrew as Bahadur Ganda. Taming of the Shrew as Bahadur Ganda. Did it in 1945, I think. These are the examples of imitation as suggested by John Dryden. Therefore, they are of little use for us as readers of translation. At the beginning, I gave out a long list of names of scholars who have translated or adapted Shakespeare. Therefore, Masi Venkateswara translations are literal translations. Most of them have not been staged, maybe for the same reason, and they are literal translations. They have not appealed either to the readers or to the theatre goers. They have not been staged. That is the first thing that we need to take into account. Some of the recent translations can be categorized as belonging to the paraphrase category. K.S. Bhagwan's Julius Caesar and H.S. Shivaprakash's King Lear. These translations can be taken as the paraphrase category. So it is a well-known fact that in the Indian context, the comparative literature study is much beneficial, as Cecil Kumar Das, a very influential critic of Indian writer in English, says in his influential article, Muses in Isolation. That's the title of the article, Muses in Isolation. Cecil Kumar Das talks very highly of comparative approach. Through comparative approach, he is one of the leading comparatists. Those who are experts in comparative literature are called comparatists. Cecil Kumar Das is really one such redoubtable scholar. Because through comparative approach, our sensibility gets enriched. It is not impoverished, but it gets enriched. We have to compare what is happening in Kannada and what is happening in Marathi, for example, what is happening in Bengali, so on and so forth. Therefore, this comparative approach always sharpens our sensibility and enriches our consciousness. Churumuri Sheshgiri Rao translated Kalidasa's Abhignana Shakuntalam in 1869. As I have already referred to, Deputy Chandrasappa had adapted the Comedy of Errors in 1871. So we have Abhignana Shakuntalam in 1869. Immediately after that, almost 2 years later, we come across the Comedy of Errors in adaptation, 1871. That means what? The Kannada writers made a first attempt at translating Kalidasa. Our writers began the process of adapting Shakespeare to our language. It appears almost a simultaneous process. So it's a matter of curiosity to ponder over why our writers adapted Shakespeare in the beginning instead of translating. Why this adaptation and not translation? As has been mentioned earlier, even the writers of Marathi, Gujarati, Hindi, Punjabi and Bengali adapted Shakespeare instead of translating him to begin with. So D.V. Gundappa's Macbeth translation, actual translation, was done in the year 1936. So this was the first ever Kannada translation of Shakespeare's play, so to say. 1936, Macbeth, with the same title, actual translation by D.V. Gundappa, one of our foremost poets. But the Kannada writers translated Shakuntalam because of the cultural affinity between Kannada and Sanskrit. In Churumuri, Othello is Raghavendra Rava, as I have already told you. Desdemona is Venkubai. Emilia is Hasta. Iago is Narsingh Raya. Okay? Because it is an adaptation, Churumuri. Iago's action is triggered by the fact that he is denied promotion. I think all of you are aware of the story of Othello. So Iago cannot accept Othello as his boss. So Narsingh Raya says in Kannada adaptation, Nanna maatu tusu kediri, andre ತಿಳಿಯುವುದು ನಾನು ಅವನ ಆಶ್ರಯ ಮಾಡಿರುವುದು ನನ್ನ ಮನಸ್ಸಿನಂತೆ ಕಾರ್ಯ ಸಾಧಿಸುವುದಕ್ಕಲ್ಲದೆ ಅನ್ಯ ಅಪೇಕ್ಷೆಯಿಂದಲ್ಲ. ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ಯಜಮಾನರೇ ಆಗಲರಿಯವಷ್ಟೇ, ಇನ್ನು ಎಲ್ಲ ಯಜಮಾನರಿಗೆ ಪ್ರಾಮಾಣಿಕರಾದ ಸೇವಕರೇ ದೊರಕುವ ಹಾಗೂ ಇಲ್ಲ. Iago goes on to describe that there are two types of servants and he clarifies his type. Narsingh Raya, ನಾನು ಈಗ ಅವನ ಅನುಸರಣೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಅವನ ಅಂದರೆ ಯಾರು? Othello. ನಾನು ಈಗ ಅವನ ಅನುಸರಣೆಯಲ್ಲಿ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಸ್ವಹಿತದ ಅನುಚರನಾಗಿದ್ದೇನೆ. ನನ್ನ ಮನಸ್ಸಿನೊಳಗಿನದು ದೇವರೇ ಬಲ್ಲ. ಆ ಪಾಮರನಲ್ಲಿ ನನ್ನ ಭಕ್ತಿಯೂ ಪ್ರೀತಿಯೂ ಎಳ್ಳಷ್ಟಾದರೂ ಇಲ್ಲ. ಆದ್ರೇನು, ಬಹಿರಂಗಕ್ಕೆ ಇದ್ದಂತೆ ತೋರಿಸಬೇಕಾಗುತ್ತದೆ. ದೇವರು ನನ್ನ ಹೊರಗಿನ ಕೆಲಸಗಳ ಮೇಲೆ ಹೋಗಬೇಡ್ರಿ, ನಾನು ಹೊರಗೆ ಒಬ್ಬನು, ಒಳಗೆ ಮತ್ತೊಬ್ಬನು. Those of you who are familiar with Othello will certainly make a connection. So, I am not what I am, he says in the play. Oh sir, content you, I follow him to serve my turn upon him. We cannot be all masters, nor all masters cannot be truly followed. You shall mark many a duteous and knee-crooking knave that doting on his own obsequious bondage wears out his time much like his master's ass. So Iago's words reflect his Machiavellian deception. Politics ಅಲ್ಲಿ Machiavellianism ಅಂತ ಇದೆ. Machiavellianism. So Iago is an expert in Machiavellian deception. Narsingh Rava's words reflect a 19th century man's ambitious nature. Raghavendra Rava is the first Kannada play written in the 19th century colonial society. Churumuri has made of Shakespeare's play Othello to express the changed sensibility of the 19th century. MS ಪುಟ್ಟಣ್ಣ ಅಂತ ಒಬ್ಬರಿದ್ದಾರೆ, ಕೇಳಿದ್ದೀರಾ? ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಬಹಳ ದೊಡ್ಡ ಕಾದಂಬರಿಕಾರರು. He has enriched the literary genre of novel in Kannada. So MS Puttanna transformed Cymbeline of all the plays. ಶೇಕ್ಸ್ಪಿಯರ್ ನಾಟಕಗಳಲ್ಲಿ ಈ ಹೆಸರೇ ಕೇಳಿರಲ್ಲ ಬಹಳ ಜನ. Cymbeline, one of the very rarely enacted plays. As early as 1891, MS Puttanna transformed the Shakespearean play into a novel. Remember that? He made it into a novel. ಒಂದು ಕಾದಂಬರಿ ಬರೆದರು, ಜಯಸಿಂಹ ರಾಜ ಚರಿತ್ರೆ ಅಂತ. Cymbeline, ಜಯಸಿಂಹ ರಾಜ ಚರಿತ್ರೆ, 1891. Again, MS Puttanna adapted King Lear in 1899 as Hemachandra Vilasa. This is King Lear. Hemachandra Vilasa, in that work, Puttanna conveys himself to show the darker side of Goneril and Regan. He ignores Lear's short-sightedness, the quarrel over the property and the distinction of the relationship between the sisters, so on and so forth. ತನಗೇನು ಬೇಕೋ ಅಷ್ಟು ಮಾತ್ರ ತಗೊಂಡ್ರು ಅವರು MS Puttanna. ಆ ಉಳಿದದನ್ನೆಲ್ಲ ಬಿಟ್ಬಿಟ್ರು. ಅಯ್ಯೋ ಆ ದುರಂತ, ಟ್ರ್ಯಾಜಿಡಿ, ಆ ಗಾನ್ವೆಲ್ ರೀಗನ್ ಹೊಡೆದಾಟ, ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ಯಾಕೆ ಬೇಕು ತಲೆನೋವು ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ತನಗೇನು ಬೇಕೋ ಅಷ್ಟು ಮಾತ್ರ ತಗೊಂಡ್ರು. ಇದೆಲ್ಲ ನಡೆದಿದೆ ಅಂತ ನಿಮಗೆ ಹೇಳೋದಕ್ಕಷ್ಟೇ. ಕನ್ನಡದಲ್ಲಿ ಅಡ್ಯಾಪ್ಟೇಷನ್ನಲ್ಲಿ all these things have taken place, and this is our creative writer's response to Shakespeare. So what happened as a result? It has become M.S. Putranna's work, Hemachandra Vilasa, has become a simple and melodramatic version where we see the violent side of two sisters, Goneril and Regan, who vie with each other to relegate an old man where he ought to belong. This king, Lear, is just an old man, and these daughters, teach him a lesson for his excessive behavior. Romeo and Juliet was adapted during the last phase of the 19th century and the early part of the 20th century. In all the three adaptations, the title remains the same, Ramavarma Leelavati. Three people have adapted Romeo and Juliet. Three playwrights have adapted Romeo and Juliet, and all the three of them given the same title, Ramavarma Leelavati. Ramavarma dash Leelavati. The names of these adapters are A.V. Varadachar, Jayaraya Charya, and A. Anand Rao. These are the three playwrights who adapted the play Romeo and Juliet as Ramavarma Leelavati. The common factor in all these three company dramas, they were not actual amateur plays, they were company dramas. The common factor in that at the end, when Leelavati Ramavarma commits suicide, in Shakespearean play, Romeo and Juliet commit suicide at the end. Ramavarma and Leelavati also commit suicide in these Kannada adaptations. But the surprising thing is that at the end, God appears and they are reborn. This is the trick of the Indian theatre, Kannada theatre. God manifests himself, bringing them back to life and disappears. God even expresses his appreciation of Leelavati's steadfastness in observing Pativratya. Neenu Pativata Shravani ಅಂತ ಹೇಳಿ ಒಂದು ಮೆಚ್ಚುಗೆಯನ್ನು ಕೂಡ ದೇವರು ವ್ಯಕ್ತಪಡಿಸಿ ಅಂತರ್ಧಾನರಾದರು ಅಂತ ಬರುತ್ತೆ. Manifesting and disappearing. Antardhana, disappearing. So this is the Kannada response to Shakespeare's plays. In Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet, there is no God. There is only the hatred between two families. What are these two families? Montagues and Capulets. But unfortunately, the Capulets and Montagues realize the futility of hatred, nurturing hatred, futility of nurturing hatred only after the death of Romeo and Juliet. Nothing can be done now. They express the futility of nurturing hatred, but what is the use? Only after the death of this star-crossed lovers, Romeo and Juliet. So in the adaptations, God appears at the end and causes the well-being of all, and therefore we do not find the awareness dawning on the rival families. In Shakespeare, the awareness dawns on the rival families, but in the adaptations, Kannada adaptations, there is no possibility of the awareness dawning on the rival families, because God resolves all the problems and there is no problem at all about the futility of their hatred. The same fate overtook the adaptations of The Taming of the Shrew. Lakshman Rao adapted it as Chandi Madamardana Nataka. Look at the title. Chandi Madamardana Nataka, 1910, 1910. This is Lakshman Rao. Another adapter, whose name is Gadigeya Huchaya Honnapura Matha, called his Taming of the Shrew as Tratika Nataka. Tratika Nataka, he wrote it in 1920, 10 years after Lakshman Rao's attempt. Yet we have one more attempt in the recent past, in the 20th century, Parvatavani. He called it, as I already said, Bahadur Ganda, 1945. The adaptations of Taming of Shrew were meant for those who have no time for reading serious work of literature, because all these adaptations simplify the Shakespearean play to a large extent. Therefore, it is only meant for the readers were not serious, who were not used to reading serious works of literature. All three adaptations have missed the subtle irony of Shakespeare, who questions the very idea that Catherine must allow herself to be tamed by Petruchio in order to maintain domestic peace. Okay? Shakespeare rejects this very idea. If you take note of the content of the play very seriously, Shakespeare is not expecting you to teach Catherine a lesson. Petruchio is not required there at all. In fact, he is saying the opposite. He is indicating, implying. Shakespeare is hinting at the opposite. Gedige Onnapuramata's Tratika Natka has a subtitle called Mondaganda Tunta Hendati. He gives a subtitle Onnapuramata. He is not happy with just happy with the title Tratika Nataka. He even supplies the subtitle Mondaganda Tunta Hendati. This play as well as Parvatavani's Bahadur Ganda have arrived at the inference that in order to uphold the dignity of the family, an independent thinking wife ought to be tamed or educated, within quotes. An independent thinking woman or wife ought to be tamed. That's the reason why taming of the shrew. These Kannada adapters take that as a literal meaning, but Shakespeare, as I said, is implying exactly the opposite thing, that this woman Catherine does not require a Petruchio to tame her because she represents the feminist point of view. The Taming of the Shrew is a feminist play. ಬಹಳ ಜನ ಅರ್ಥ ಮಾಡ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ಅದೊಂದು ಪೇಟ್ರಿಯಾರ್ಕಲ್ ಫಿಲಾಸಫಿ ಅಡ್ವೊಕೇಟ್ ಮಾಡೋ ನಾಟಕ ಅಂತ ತಿಳ್ಕೊಂಡಿದ್ದಾರೆ. ವಾಸ್ತವವಾಗಿ ಇಟ್ ಈಸ್ ಎ ಫೆಮಿನಿಸ್ಟ್ ಪ್ಲೇ. Shakespeare has showed clearly what is at stake for a woman when she is confined within the four walls. This play should have given an opportunity to the adapters to question the male-centric society's attitude towards women. The adapters did not make use of that opportunity. It provided an opportunity, but they did not understand the subtlety of the play. Our attention is drawn to one particular danger that the adaptations of Shakespeare plays face. What is that danger? The deep meanings are embedded in the symbols, imageries, and the use of words. They are not in the plots. We wrongly thought that Shakespeare plays the meaning or in the plots. Actually, they are not in the plots, they are in the symbols, imageries, and the use of words. We need to pay attention to these things. So Lakshman Rao, Annapurmat, and Bharatwani seem to have latched on to the plot, missing the soul of the play. If you pay too much attention to the plot, you are going to miss the symbols and imageries. That is what has happened in the case of these adapters. Simplification of the original plays is seen in Andhra Rao's Panchali Parinaya. Yavadara adaptation idu? Panchali Parinaya. Idu Merchant of Venice. Other adaptation. Panchali Parinaya by Anand Rao. Shivram Karanth, the great novelist, also has made an attempt to adapt Shakespeare, especially Shakespeare's Hamlet. Shivram Karanth calls his Hamlet as Hemanta. He wrote it in 1935, and you are all familiar with Coimbu's attempt at adapting Shakespeare's plays, especially Raktakshi and Birugali. Birugali is The Tempest, Raktakshi is Hamlet by Coimbu. Birugali was adapted in 1930. Hamlet was adapted in 1932 by Coimbu. Compared to Anand Rao's Panchali Parinaya, Kerur Vasudevacharya's adaptation of The Merchant of Venice Surata Nagarada Shreshti. He calls the Merchant of Venice as Surata Nagarada Shreshti, which he adapted in 1929. It is a successful attempt. Vasudevacharya's attempt is a successful attempt because here Kathor Malla is Shylock, and Kathor Malla belongs to the Marwari community. In Shakespeare's play, Shylock belongs to Jew. He is a Jewish. Here, Kirur Vasudevacharya makes Kathor Malla belonging to Marwari community, and we all know how Marwaris are dedicated to their business. Very dedicated people to their business. Shivram Karanth adapted Hamlet as Hemanta in 1935, and it was staged at Bangalore, they say. When it was staged, I don't know. But this much is true. Karanth did not publish it in a book forum till 1982. Almost 50 years later, he brought it out in a book form. Remember? He wrote it in 1935 and then published in a book form in 1982, almost 5 decades later, but making certain changes. So as an example of Karanth's simplification, we can consider soliloquy which occurs in Act 1, Scene 5, lines 92 to 104. Hamlet says in Shivram Karanth's adaptation, Digdevatagale, Swarga Martya Pathalagale, ನನ್ನನ್ನು ಕುಸಿದು ಬೀಳದಂತೆ ಎತ್ತಿ ಹಿಡಿಯಿರಿ, ಎಲುಬು ಮಾಂಸಗಳೇ ಇಷ್ಟರಲ್ಲಿ ನನ್ನನ್ನು ಬಿಡಬೇಡಿ. ಓ ಬಡಪಾಯಿ ಪ್ರೇತವೇ, ಕೇಳಿ ತಿಳಿದೆ ನಿನ್ನ ದುರ್ವಿಧಿಯನ್ನು, ಏಕೋ ನಿನಗೆ ಅಭಯ, ಶಾಂತಿಯಿಂದ ಮರಳು, ಭೂತ ಭವಿಷ್ಯತ್ತುಗಳ ಪಾಪಗಳ ಅರಣ್ಯವನ್ನೇ ನನ್ನೆದುರು ಸುಟ್ಟು ಉರಿಸುತ್ತೇನೆ, ನಿನ್ನ ಅನುಜ್ಞೆಯೇ ನನ್ನ ಏಕಮಾತ್ರ ಧ್ಯೇಯ, ಭಾವನೆಗೂ ಆಸರೆಯನ್ನು ನೀಡೆ. So says Karanth's Hamlet or Hemanta. Now, Shakespeare's Hamlet says, in a corresponding situation, all you host of heaven, O earth, what else? And shall I couple hell? O fire, hold my heart, and you, my sinews, grow not instant old, but hear me stiffly up, bear me stiffly up. Remember thee, thou poor ghost, whilst memory holds a seat in this distracted globe, remember thee. Karanth has left host of heaven, shall I couple hell, distracted globe, without translating. The rest of it is a summary translation of the original. This is how our adapters have done with Shakespeare. Even in Coimbu's adaptation of Hamlet, which is Raktakshi, the conflicts are not important, or the conflict is not important. So in Hamlet, conflict is the most important thing, as you all know, but Coimbu makes a different thing important and not the conflict. So one of the soliloquies of Hamlet begins with, oh, that this too solid flesh, oh, that this too solid flesh. This soliloquy has been substituted with Basavaya's soliloquy. Basavaya is the protagonist. Basavaya is Hamlet's counterpart in Coimbu's play. Basavaya says, ಎಷ್ಟು ತೊಡಕಾದುದಿ ಈ ಭುವಿಯ ಬಾಳು, ಇಂತಹ ತಾರುಣ್ಯದಲ್ಲೇ ಕಷ್ಟವೇಕೆ, ಕಷ್ಟದಶೆ, ಬಾಳೆಂಬುದೇ ಹಾಡು, ಹುಟ್ಟದಿರುವುದೇ ಲೇಸು, ಹುಟ್ಟಿದರೆ ಹಾಡು ಕರ್ಮದ ಬುದ್ಧಿ, ನಮ್ಮ ಹಿಂದುಗಡೆ ಬಂದೇ ಬರುವುದು ನೆರಳಿನಂತೆ, ನಾನು ಸ್ವಪ್ನ ಮುದ್ರಿತ ಜೀವಿ, ಅದನ್ನರಿತೆ ಎಲ್ಲರೂ ನನ್ನನ್ನು ಉಪೇಕ್ಷಿಸುತ್ತೆ ನಡೆದವರು. ಓ ತಂದೆ, ನನ್ನೊಬ್ಬನನ್ನು ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಹೋದಿರೆಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ನೀವು. ಈಸ್ ಅಡ್ರೆಸಿಂಗ್ ಹಿಸ್ ಫಾದರ್ಸ್ ಗೋಸ್ಟ್, ದಿ ಅಪರೇಷನ್. ಓ ತಂದೆ, ನನ್ನನ್ನೊಬ್ಬನೇ ಬಿಟ್ಟು ಹೋದಿರೆಲ್ಲಿಗೆ ನೀವು, ನಿಮ್ಮ ನುಡಿದ ನನಗೆ ಲೋಕವೇ ಬೆಳ್ಳಾಗಿ ಹೋಗಿಬಿಡು. ಏನೊಂದೂ ಬೇಡವಾಗಿದೆ ನನಗೆ, ನನ್ನ ಮಲತಾಯಿ ಆ ರಾಕ್ಷಸಿ, ಆ ಶನಿ ಸೇನಾಧಿಪತಿಯೊಡನೆ ಸರಸಕ್ಕಾರಂಭಿಸಿದಳು. ಓ ಪಿತನೆ, ವಂಶಕ್ಕೆ ಕಳಂಕವನ್ನು ಬರುತ್ತಿಲ್ಲ. In the original, Hamlet does not say that this life is meaningful. Kuempu's character says with finality that there is meaning in life. He cannot take a decision whether he has to proceed with the plan of finishing Claudius. Even when his participation in his father's death is confirmed, Hamlet's entire personality is consumed by questions and doubts regarding himself and others. But Kuempu's Basavaya has no doubt at all. He accepts the ghost's words readily. If you remember the original Shakespearean play, there is so much doubt in the minds of the young Hamlet whether what he sees in the middle of the night is true. Therefore, he requests his friend, confidant Horatio, being a scholar, interpret what the ghost says for my sake. Interpret, you are a scholar. Therefore, there is question, there is doubt, there is all this prevarication, but not in Kuempu's Basavaya. He, believes ghosts straight away. He describes himself as a Swapna Mudrita Jivi. Beautiful expression. This is the result of the simplistic adaptation of the complex character of Hamlet. Therefore, the concrete images are reduced to abstract forms in the adaptation, etc., etc. Soliloquy ideyala, this too solid flesh would melt, thorn resolve itself into a dew. It becomes an abstract short statement